Hi class, we're talking in our last module before the conclusion of this course about one of the most interesting countries in the world, about the one of the countries that has had most promise and most disappointment, at least as far as I'm concerned, with respect to mass media, to its newspapers, to its radio stations, to its television stations, magazine, and so on. Of course, we're talking about Russia. I grew up in Russia as a child. I was about a year and a half when I first went there. I spent my first years of school in Russia, and I have followed Russia ever since. And it was a very interesting country to start with, but during the mid 80s, starting with 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, became the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union at the time, and essentially the leader of the state. He instituted several very interesting reforms. The dual, direction that he was going in, he was trying to create political transformation, political change, social change, economic change above all, because the Russian or Soviet economy at the time was not doing well at all. So he started something called perestroika, which roughly translates to change or reorganization. This involved various levels of political power, economic system transformation, and so on and so on. The part that is more interesting from the perspective of our class is the so-called glasnost, which again, roughly translated, means probably openness or the ability to speak about certain events or certain developments in especially in Soviet history that were not discussed before. So crimes of Stalinism and even the current state at the time of the economy, which was not openly discussed. A whole range of topics suddenly became open for debate. They became part of the media. The newspapers were, flush with new voices, new very talented journalists, reporters, opinion writers, people who were expressing their concern with the current state of Russia, the developments that were going on at the time, the place of Russia or Soviet Union. I kind of use Russia and Soviet Union interchangeably, which of course is technically very incorrect. But kind of a habit, Russian-centric habit. So glasnost was a very interesting phenomenon because for the first time on that side of the Iron Curtain, on that side of the Berlin Wall, which you remember again from your class or from your other lessons that you have had in other classes, fell in 1989. So for the first time, the east of the Berlin Wall, certain topics were openly discussed, and that was a very abrupt change and break with the tradition from years before, because censorship was very strict in all these socialist/communist countries. Journalists were very tightly controlled. Media were tightly controlled. Media professionals were essentially propaganda workers. They were not to inform about the news per se. They were mostly concerned with bringing, down to the masses, if I can put it this way, whatever the Communist Party, the leaders of the country, felt or thought should be, discussed with the population, with the populace. So when Gorbachev came to power and started the glasnost period, or the glasnost trend, this led to, as I said, changes that were absolutely unheard of in the rest of the Soviet space. So countries of the Eastern Europe, who were not technically or politically part of the Soviet Union, but they were allies, and they were essentially subservient to this great superpower. In my own Bulgaria, my own country of Bulgaria, the openness was nowhere near that level. So local publications, the newspapers, the TV in Bulgaria was not discussing issues of history, issues, contemporary issues of society, of economics, of the world, with the same level of frankness and directness that was characteristic of the Soviet media at the time. And that was a very interesting juxtaposition. That's why, as essentially somebody in my late teens at the time, I was a voracious reader of Russian newspapers, of Russian magazines. I was watching Russian TV. It was a very, very interesting period when Russian media was so much ahead of everybody else in the Soviet world. I use Soviet world as part of the denomination for ex-socialist or ex-communist countries in the mid-80s. Well, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, the change came to that part of the world very rapidly as well. And countries of Eastern Europe started a very rapid transformation of their own. The media followed very quickly. For instance, media in Bulgaria, newspapers in Bulgaria in particular, if in the fall of 1989, 100% of the newspapers were government-owned, in the fall of 1990 or spring of 1991, 100% of newspapers, of the print media in my own country, Bulgaria, were privately owned. So very rapid, very quick transformation as well. And as you can imagine, the topics, the issues were, also, very, very much not what they were just a year or two before. It was open discussion. Nothing was taboo anymore. Nothing was censored. Nothing was forbidden for discussion in the media. So very rapid transformation. But it all started in the former Soviet Union, the USSR at the time. Now, the Soviet Union ceased as a country formally in the December of 1991, and its main parts became independent republics. So Ukraine and Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, 15 separate republics emerged from the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And of course, Russia is the principal one of them. It's still the largest country in the world, still a country with very literate population, very active population, very, again, interesting past very fascinating, present. What happened with Russian media, and you can see this from your readings, of course, but in the early to mid 90s, Russian media were, probably enjoying a period of a very strong development as well, which kind of continued the trend from the mid to late 80s. There was a lot of new media. The internet, of course, was emerging at the time, so it did not pass as a trend, Russia. Lots of new TV channels, radio stations, print publications, late 90s, as I said already, online media. Again, very rapid, very substantial development, flourishing of lots of the media freedoms that we saw happening in mid 90s, mid 80s, and on. Unfortunately, I can say that since about the year 2000, or with the coming to power of first Prime Minister and then President Vladimir Putin, and then Prime Minister again, and now President again, there has been a reverse trend in Russian media. Yeah, you can say I'm not a big fan of this guy. One of the reasons is that he has managed to consolidate his power in part by being able to systematically control the media channels in the country, and there are a variety of means to do this. It's not necessarily overt or direct censorship, which is almost virtually impossible nowadays, especially with the internet and the proliferation of different media outlets. But there are more insidious ways and more oblique ways to be able to co-opt the media or intimidate the media, essentially eliminate the opposition through media, which has been the case in Russia in the past 15, 16 years. If you look at various press indices of freedom, for instance, in your supplementary materials in the resources, you have Reporters Without Borders, which put Russia as number 148, 150 or something like that, out of 190 something countries in the world. The another index by Freedom House, which is another organization that monitors the freedoms around the world, including the media freedom, also ranks Russian media pretty low. Russian media are ranked as not free by the Freedom House. It's mostly because of the nationalistic tone of Russian media, which has become dominant, unfortunately. Your textbook talks a little bit about this, but the problem with that is that it just continues to drown out independent, critical journalism. It stresses patriotic themes, and no disrespect to patriotism, but there are ways to stamp out dissent if you declare media unpatriotic. I mean, we do not have to go too back into our own history. Remember that in 2003, for instance, one of the reasons that mainstream media in the United States were so complacent and even complicit with the build up to the war in Iraq was that everybody who was against that uh, process and against the build up, against the war drumbeat was accused of being non-patriotic. So no country is immune to that, but in Russia this has been particularly pronounced. And we saw various instances of that, especially in the past few years with the military incursions into Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, even the airstrikes in Syria, where, of course, the Russian government, for its own political reasons, supports the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Where all this leaves us is that in Russia, the media happen to be less than free, uh, even though nominally there is a wide diversity of media outlets. There are something like 10 national TV channels. 3-4 of them are bigger ones, and the rest are a bit smaller. There is a variety of radio stations, many print, online outlets. But the problem is that audiences of truly independent, truly critical, truly watchdog, oppositional media outlets, their audience is just not as big or as sustained as the audience of outlets that are pro-government, controlled sometimes directly or sometimes through being subsidiaries of government owned companies or state-owned companies. Rather, variety of intimidation ways exist, including through made-up tax audits, through appointing people who would be likely to toe the official government line or Kremlin's line on the media, on the boards of directors, and so on and so on and so on. There has been very interesting set of developments with respect to Russia's media becoming also more active abroad. One great example of that is the Russia Today channel, which is also known as RT, that's their brand, who were able to create a very sleek, very professional, very persuasive media operation, huge channel on YouTube. You can look it up in, again, the supplementary materials provided for this section. They were able to hire some high-profile Western reporters, Western anchors, including Larry King, also one of the best-known names from CNN. It's a 100% state-owned, state-funded channel. They do not use advertising. They do not have advertising. So their model is just depending on state money. So, I mean, you tell me whose interest they will be protecting. Then the other very interesting development has been related to the so-called hybrid wars, and you have all heard about the accusations of Russian hackers hacking into the DNC, databases and email systems and and whatnot. And as a reason why, these magazines, here say, oh, Putin, 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 bad guy Putin. But there is some substantial truth behind this hysteria, and it is that indeed in our post-factual, post-truth world, it is very easy, surprisingly easy, for rogue players, for well supported you know operations to basically throw the international communication and create all kinds of fake news stories, or derail the discussion. At one time, the Guardian, the British newspaper, which can hardly be accused of being pro-government or anything like that. It's owned by its own staffers, and it's a pretty liberal newspaper by all standards. They were deleting about 40,000 comments a day that were coming from something that became known as troll fabrics in Russia, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Again, you have some information about this in your readings. I'm also attaching a big report on the so-called hybrid wars. It's an interesting development. I would let you be the judges on this. My colleague, Professor Kazakov, is given you his short take on Russian media. I think that the best approach is to read a variety of sources, think about what's going on, why things are the way that they happen. In the case with Russia today, I would ask you to be really judgmental about the fact that if a certain government pays for a certain media outlet, you should probably not expect too much independence out of them. And even though it looks really sleek, again, think about it. That's it about Russia. I can talk very, very long about this subject, but it is definitely one of the most interesting media developments in the past, I would say, 20, maybe 30 years. Worth studying, worth learning about this fascinating country, worth talking to its people, maybe even worth learning Russian. До свидания.